Very good afternoon, morning, or evening to you, and welcome to this edition of A Reason for Hope. Sean Richards hosting today with the notorious Burrito to, of course, answer your Bible questions for the next hour. The purpose of this broadcast is, of course, to fulfill that, but since it is also, at the time of this recording, Monday, we're also going to be dedicating the opening of the broadcast to our apologetics topic, and that, of course, being the historical evidence for King David. If you already had your interest piqued, feel free to continue to listen. But if you want to send in your questions and address issues on your heart and on your mind, we will be setting aside time for that as well as throughout the week. The purpose of the broadcast remains unchanged. If you would like to email us your questions, we are happy to receive them at our email address, questions@areason4hope.org. There, of course, you can send us questions during and after the broadcast. We'll be keeping an eye on the email address as the program is ongoing. But if you, say, receive the inspiration for the question at an inopportune time where we aren't live, don't worry, the email address is for more than just that narrow window. And, of course, if you're listening to us on any of our other live streaming platforms but don't have a social media profile relevant to those programs, then you can use this email address as well, which, once again, questions, plural, at symbol, areason4hope.org. We're looking forward to receiving your questions, both the Burrito and I, and Pastor Scott later throughout the week. But note, if you want to engage with us face-to-face, there are ways you can send your questions to us there as well. If you have a YouTube account, it is A Reason 4 Hope. You subscribe to us there and hit the notification bell. You'll be informed when we are live in your respective time zone. And, of course, you can also send us your questions by comments in each individual video during our biweekly Bible studies at Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson, where, of course, we are also live streaming on our YouTube panel, or I should say channel. And, of course, you can leave us your questions in the live chat if you're able to join us live every single weekday from 4 to 5 p.m. Arizona time. If you would prefer something other than YouTube, Facebook is an option at Calvary Christian Fellowship of Tucson, or facebook.com/CCFTUCSON. Give us a like there, and you'll get all the benefits of YouTube without the YouTube and the added bonus of our morning devotions with our assistant pastor, Bo Ouellette. You'll have access to our Bible studies. You'll be able to private message us your questions through the Facebook inbox. And, of course, leave your questions in the comments, which we'll be watching as the broadcast unfolds. We'll be happy to address your questions if sent along to us there. If you would like to join us on Twitter or X, it is Scott R4H, SCOTT. The letter R, the number 4, the letter H, and we'll be happy to address your questions in tweet format if you just give the @ symbol, SCOTTR4H, and we'll be able to read them off in the broadcast and answer them as the Lord equips us. We also have an opportunity to receive your questions by direct inbox. You can message us privately there as well. And if you want to join us live face-to-face in the comment sections of our live streaming videos, they are hosting us on their platform. When you see the red ring around the Twitter page, the profile picture of SCOTTR4H, you can, of course, join us through that window that will pop up. And on the right side of the screen, you can leave your comments publicly or message us privately, whichever you prefer. If you prefer not to have a social media account, our website is calvarychristianfellowship.com. That's CALVARY Christianfellowship.com. There you can, of course, click on the Watch Live tab and join us where we are live streaming every single weekday. But note that there isn't an playlist set up for those things. It will automatically play the previous one. If you want to listen to specific broadcasts, you can search through them in our video archives, but that will, of course, be limited if you are joining us live. Some like to combine the two, have a social media platform inform them when they are live, but not give the platform viewership, instead going to our website. That's completely fine. Use those notifications so you can. We also have notifications we can send you, but the main benefit of our website is that we don't have to get any personal information from you. You all have to do is just type in a name. It doesn't have to be your name, but leave a Bible question, and we'll be happy to address it as the broadcast is unfolding. And if we are off hours, and it is, of course, automatically playing a previous broadcast, we don't archive the questions. We will be able to receive your questions by email, though, and that will, of course, be how we can engage with you after the broadcast or in between each session. Without further ado, we've got a lot of information to cover. despite what the claims of modern archaeologists would want you to think, and of course have it all centered in God's Word. And since he is the subject of this, why don't we take a moment to ask him to speak more on this broadcast and be honored by the time that we're allowing him to be glorified in our lives. Dad, thank you for the opportunity and honor you've given us to not only be in your word, but among your people. And I also pray that we would be in your spirit, that there would be a work of not only miracles done in equipping me to be able to speak effectively, but an even greater miracle in your people having ears to hear and understand it. Allow what's communicated here to strengthen our confidence in you, to be centered in truth, protected from error, and equipped for the kind of challenges that are awaiting us regarding not only our own thoughts, but this world in opposition to you. The internet's a dark place, but we know that you remain the light wherever you are brought, so we ask that you would make yourself a light and a source of truth, even on this social media platform that we're using in our generation. We ask this all in the name of your Son. Amen. So, without further ado, the historical evidence for King David. If you were able to join us last week in Esther, we're going to take a similar approach. But when it comes to, again, not just understanding that this data is out there, why it is relevant in the conversations that you'll be having with people, it's also important to understand why this is important for every Christian to be able to give an effective answer for, at least in terms of knowing that the answers do exist. Because when it comes to examining things like secular history and the historical standards put forward by the founders of the archaeological pursuits like Napoleon Bonaparte and others, there's a temptation for Christians to either justify laziness, and obviously we won't exert that much effort in being that honest with ourselves, but even in terms of saying that, well, those are the world standards, I want the Bible standards. Well, Jesus himself said in the Gospel of John chapter 3 and verse 12 that when he was speaking to the Pharisee Nicodemus, if I tell you earthly things and you do not believe, how will you then believe if I tell you about heavenly things? The revelation of God's Word is, in fact, in the format and context of history. And we ought to know how historians are going to be looking at the information provided to us in the Bible, so we not only understand the genre of it, but in the same way, it would be like considering literacy worldly and wanting to instead read the Bible. We can, in fact, learn how to read and write from a secular world standards and still effectively apply it to spiritual truths. Now, when it comes to just not only the why this is important, but the why as far as justifying our time and energy, there's generally three responses people give as far as a historical topic being brought up. Some people have genuine interest. They think that the subject is worth the effort that it would require to read and to understand everything involved. There's also people who would approach this with a bit of fear. They would anticipate or have experienced a situation where this information would be needed. That's a lot of motivation in my early days of apologetic study. But there's also people who would approach history indifferently. They would wonder, why is it so important to learn what happened to old people? Why can't I just know how to live my life today? And the problem with all of these approaches is that they aren't answers to questions. They're simply attitudes. We're all going to learn history one way or another, whether it's our own in ironically mirroring the lessons of those before us, but also understanding as well, as the secular historian George Santayana once observed, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. We're going to need to understand why a full third, actually 2/3 of our Bibles are dedicated to history and, of course, are set in real times, real places, and with real people. And if we can't show where and when those things are actually grounded in of themselves, then what we've done to a world that has no reason to trust the Bible until the Spirit equips us to give them to people, it's going to be consigned to mythology. And appropriately so, if that book only had itself as a testimony to be taken seriously at all. So understand that if you're interested in the field of history in or outside of the Bible, it's only the first step in knowing what is and what isn't going to make a difference to us as believers. The historical questions that we need to ask are, of course, relevant in terms of, and especially what we'll be getting into soon, regarding the person of Jesus of Nazareth. But we also need to take into consideration the other people mentioned in the Bible as well, because the first witness of who Jesus was in history was tying him back family-wise into two historical figures, that of Abraham and that of David. So since Jesus is obviously the center of our focus, and we will give due time to him in the future, I want to focus on that historical figure, because the historical question, did David exist, or was he just a fictional character created to communicate deeper spiritual truths? We end up throwing out the credibility of the Bible without knowing it, not just because of our indifference, but because the Bible's own testimony ties the historical figure, Jesus, to another historical figure who we should have reason to believe existed, since he is in fact so central in our Lord's entry into this world. So understand, that's what we want to take the next hour or so to do, is to ask, why does this question need to be answered? What is the most reasonable answer to that question, and what reasons do we have to believe the answers provided? So starting with, again, that first point, why would we need to answer this question? As I said, and it breaks my heart to have to communicate this, but legitimate Christian ministries think that by conceding this point or others in order to get people into quote-unquote more important issues like the gospel, you can justify that line of thinking and saying that yes, the gospel is an important issue to clarify with people, but when you have the mindset of, okay, I'll let you poke a few more holes in this boat as long as we can plug the one that's right in front of us, that ends up solving fewer problems and just creating more. And this is the point. If every time you're challenged on something, you concede it may or may not have been true, but still consider it worth being taught because it can teach us something valuable, suddenly your reasons for believing the Bible have just come to the surface. You don't believe Jesus' claims and promises apply to reality. You just treat it like a fun story, but ultimately indistinguishable from Star Wars. And that very narrative is being pushed, and we need to know why we ought to push back. There's a reason why we'd make a distinction between people like Jordan Peterson, for example, who acknowledges the poetic structure and the influential language and the idealized history and the themes of Scripture without actually being a Christian, and of course those who claim that the Bible is a revelation of God to mankind. I would be happy to do a Jordan Peterson impression if you would so prefer, but for the sake of time I'll only do it by request. The second point that we want to ask is, again, what's the most reasonable answer to this question? We need to know these things because we don't want to undermine the very credibility we get all information about Jesus from. And if we're here to tell people about Jesus, we want that grounded in actual history and in reasonable terms. But the answer in of itself is fairly straightforward, because especially regarding today's topic, that being of King David, there's no reason to dismiss the Old Testament figure, David, as a purely historic, or on a purely historical basis. We have as much evidence for his existence as anyone else that would be acknowledged in ancient history, specifically 3,000 years ago. And also noting for Christians, you have no reason to reject David as a real figure of history because, as we stated before, Jesus ties his family lineage to him. And unless you deny Jesus' family didn't exist, that, of course, would be important for us to clarify in intelligent terms. So note that there's no reason for these things to be dismissed, and I think that in of itself is a reason why it ought to be taken seriously. But the evidence still needs to be presented. So what is the reason why, or what are the reasons why, we should believe that David was a historical person? Well, before we get into the actual evidence, we need to understand the nature of conversation and language, because the internet has almost robbed us of that as of late. When we are asking for the truth in historical evidence, what do we mean by history, what do we mean by evidence, and what do we mean by truth? History literally comes from the word histor, which means eyewitness. Someone was there to have seen something and reported or recorded it in some meaningful way. We note that evidence isn't something that would remove all doubt on a particular subject, but it is something, a person, a place, or a thing that would give us more reason to believe something else is grounded in truth. And truth is what would accurately reflect reality. It's not limited to things that are just factually correct, but it's actually relevant to and influential to our lives today. I can twist data all I want and send it in many untrue directions. But if my observations accurately reflect reality, that's what I mean by truth, is that its substance is in fact pointing me towards the nature of God, the author of reality, and whose voice itself is truth. So when it comes down to this, what are the historical evidences, meaning the eyewitness reports, the people, places, or things that would move this question, did David exist, more into the line of reality and less into the line of mythology? Well, again, as I stated, people, places, and things that actually existed. When the life and reign of David is detailed for us in 1st and 2nd Samuel, and by the way, despite the protests of the internet, the Bible is in of itself an accurate, or at least a reasonable source of evidence to look for or look through. And when it comes to the arguments and saying you're quoting the Bible to prove the Bible, no, we're using the Bible to form a claim. If I claimed that David was 40 feet tall, that would not be a claim that I could support with any source on King David. But if, on the other hand, I was able to look at these sources, the claims get formed. And then I can look for more information, or in this case, what the atheist would try to claim is less, in order to say that this claim that the Bible makes isn't in fact grounded in truth, that it's mythology, it's localized to itself. But 1st and 2nd Samuel, which are of course divided into the grand total book of the Kings, are Jewish literatures and history that mention details that we do know existed at the time. And not just the people, places, and things, but even the customs that accurately reflect other forms of ancient literature, showing that these things are in fact grounded in reality. We also can note the individuals, both in and outside of the Bible, were real people. The Philistines were wiped out by the Babylonians in the 6th century BC. Now, 600 years before Christ, if David is reported to have been 1,000 years before Christ, that means that they were still around at this time, 400 years before David's time, before that, during David's time. The same is true for other individuals that David had encounters with, the Amalekites, who disappeared from the world scene in the 5th century BC. That is, of course, during the time of Esther, whom we talked about last week. And we also note that these events are not only according to the Bible, but we can quote other historians as well, Greeks like Herodotus, non-Christians like Josephus, and all of these details are what modern historians wouldn't challenge either. The cities of Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Zilgad, Gath, all of these are still standing today or fit the descriptions given to them when discoveries were made exactly in line with where the Bible claimed they would be. The names of other kings, for example, like Achish, Saul, and others, would give us no reason to think these are fictional characters interacting with historical people, and the most significance of which would be the mention of Ahimelech, who served as priest during the historical days of the high priest Abiathar, and that is on the authority of none other than Jesus himself. The New Testament, specifically the Gospel of Mark, is a separate book from 1st and 2nd Samuel, and noting this as a report of Jesus of Nazareth, this is speaking to Christians as reason to treat it as history. Jesus did. Mark chapter 2 and verse 25, Jesus speaking said, when he was challenged about the basically violating a tradition, but not Scripture, he responds to their challenge in saying, why do the disciples not eat when it is not lawful to do so? He responds with, have you never read? That was a very amusing observation to the people he was speaking to. They were experts on the law. What David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him, how they went into the house of God in the days of Abiathar the high priest, notice referencing historical people, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priests, and also gave some to those who were with him. Now, this is obviously referencing legitimate laws of Moses, and yet the higher priority was the preservation of life. David was running for his life and needed provisions or they were going to starve. So when we note and cross-reference these things, Jesus obviously is referencing 2 Samuel 8:17 and 1 Samuel 8:17, 2 Samuel 8. And of course, 1 Chronicles 24:6, that would both clarify that Abiathar and Ahimelech were living at the same time. That's an important point to note when people claim this is a contradiction. There is such a thing as a priest serving at the time of the high priest, but this is neither here nor there. When we're noting as Christians these other mentions and these treatments of things, if Jesus put it in terms of history, and if the Bible itself presents it as history, and we can go and verify with other sources these historical claims, both in and outside of the text, which we will get into, then we can say for certain we are more in the direction of reality and less in the realm of mythology. Because noting that we don't just have written text like the New Testament, we also have archaeological discoveries, and this is specifically pertaining to King David's name himself. A discovery was made in Tel Dan, which is in northern Israel today, by the professor Avraham Biron, of a victory pillar that was dated around 100 years after the time of David's life. This pillar included a mention of the dynasty of David being overcome by the Syrians, which, by the way, would line up with the other reports in the books of Kings regarding Israel's dealings with them after the time of Rehoboam. By the way, we also note as well the death of King Solomon. You could note that the entirety of the nation of Israel and their dealings with the Syrians would not motivate them to acknowledge a made-up person or consider this enemy of Israel, whether or not this family even existed in the first place as they're accused, would be worth bragging about having defeated them in battle if they were never there in the first place, if this name didn't have some sort of reputation or heft regarding a royal line. Now, we can also note this as well. Why would you go through the effort in the ancient world of not only producing, but inscribing as a testament of victory, your victory against something that didn't happen? These are monuments that mention David in the context of royalty and as an overall representative of history by name. And that's noting the biggest note of evidence, because when we look at the Tel Dan stele and this victory monument built by the Syrians, that is the kind of testimony that historians are looking for. But we also note that on top of what we can see in the ground, what we can read with the modern copies of the information reported back to David's time, we could also note that this kind of information that we're given about him are the sort of things that historians are going to recognize as true. Not because they're so fanciful that they must be true, but because, in fact, the opposite. They're so embarrassing they would have to have been admitted rather than embellished. Because understand and this is noting the hypothetical, when you're talking about Israel's greatest king, the trend of the Middle East was obviously the same that we see politicians following today. Political spin is to only acknowledge and build each other up in what they got right. And that, of course, which we'll mention in a moment, is no reason to reject someone existed, but it notes that the details themselves may be spotty. So when it comes to such an influential name in Jewish history like King David, whether you acknowledge him as historical or not, you'd expect the author to embellish and glorify this character, if he was in fact fictional, to the point of absurdity, like we see with many other kings in ancient history, the pharaohs leading from the front and sundering entire mountains with the swing of their scythe and all this other stuff. It's ultimately meant to communicate that this person was at this time and fought in this battle. They can get past the extravagant language. But when we find something else, something that's called an account of embarrassment, we're told details that we don't see, referring to historical figures, because the general historical figures that we're aware of are those who had the funds and reputation to be able to produce these kind of monuments and reputations, who then, based off of that power going to their head, didn't want that kind of information leaking out. It's so rare in our findings of ancient historical figures that if we find embarrassing information about them, it gives historians eyebrows going all the way beyond their hairline. Not just because they don't find it ever, but because that is, in fact, reason to believe they existed. You don't admit things about people that, in fact, never happened. And it's also making a point as well that the alternative just ends up not making sense. If you're making up a hero and a king, then you would consider exaggeration on the positive, not on the negative, especially in the Middle East, when a fear-based reputation means life or death for your citizens. So let's ask ourselves a question. What are the embarrassing details that give secular and Christian and Jewish historians alike more reason to believe David was a historical figure? And the first and most important of which was, despite being called a man after God's own heart, he's acknowledged as, by these same sources, as a polygamist who would have been violating God's law for kings in their founding laws, what's called the Torah. This is Deuteronomy 17 and verse 15. God speaking says, "You shall surely set a king over you, whom the Lord your God chooses. One from among your brethren you shall set as king over you. You may not set a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. But he shall not multiply horses for himself, nor cause the people to return to Egypt to multiply horses. For the Lord said to you, you shall not return that way again. Neither shall he multiply wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he greatly multiply silver and gold for himself." Now, that was violated when we note records and acknowledgments not only of King David's harem, which was not lawful for him to take, but after the good moments in his life recorded in 1 Samuel, where he was only married to Michal and was subsequently divorced by his father-in-law Saul against his will. That wife was then replaced by Abigail, who ultimately ended up being the one that God intended for him. But nonetheless, in 2 Samuel, we see accounts of embarrassment acknowledging what? That the remarriage, the forced marriage of Michal back to him and forcing her to divorce her present husband, whom she was actually happy with, reflected the bad attitude she had towards him from that time onwards. We note that during the time of King Solomon, that the mentions of David's wives, plural, were in fact an ongoing assumption in direct violation of Torah's laws. We note that even the incident with Bathsheba, which we'll get into in a moment, was in fact a wrong thing. In 2 Samuel chapter 11, the chapter ends with this being something that displeased the Lord. It was not justified. The text itself condemns this hero for it. And it also notes that he was not only an adulterer, which was a violation of Torah's law in Exodus 20, but also a murderer and a liar. He bore false witness regarding his actions and said that, well, since, this noble man Uriah died in battle, my friend, by the way, that I'm going to take on his wife as my own. And that, also not being lawful, would be something that he would consider an act of nobility. And, of course, reflected in the Psalms, his own writings, that it was something that destroyed him from the inside out. We note that David also made compromises militarily. He became a mercenary towards the end of 1 Samuel 27 specifically, who lived towards the Philistines, notorious enemies of God's people at this point, during the end of Saul's reign. We note that David ordered an unlawful census that caused the judgment of God to fall on Israel in 2 Samuel 24, and also very embarrassing deaths about his heirs. We note that his firstborn son Amnon was reported to have raped one of his daughters in 2 Samuel 13. We note that another one of his heirs murdered that brother for the act and enacted a coup d'etat against his father in 2 Samuel 12 through 15. And that, by the way, that was as a result of David's negligence in dealing with it, according to the text that we'd expect to be embellished. And this is the point. These are not the sort of things you make up about somebody held in such high regard and stature in Jewish and Christian circles, even to this day. For these reasons, we have no reason to believe that any historical standard would put David in the fictional category. The Bible isn't just a book of history, but it records history in a way that can, in fact, be tested. So to recap, and just to give you all information, where do we get these reasons to believe that David is, in fact, in the realm of history? Well, because it mentions real people like Achish and Goliath, and we can note this in the Tell of El Safi. That's where we verified, by the way, the Philistine city of Gath, where Goliath was from and where Achish ruled from. We note that Ahimelech is noted not just within the biblical accounts, not just in the New Testament, but also by Josephus in Antiquities of the Jews, books 5 and 8. We note that King Saul is noted not just in the biblical account of his life, but also by Jewish historians outside of the Bible in Josephus's book 7 of Antiquities of the Jews, and more. We note that the real places that are mentioned during David's reign, whether it's his hometown Bethlehem, it can be viewed in the modern day. We note that Jerusalem is a real city and existed around 1,000 years before the time of Christ, even according to modern archaeological digs and finds. We note that the city of Gath, as I mentioned before, in Tel Es-Safi, is in fact a real place. We note that Ziklag, according to Tel Es-Sharia, is a real location, another Philistine settlement. And we note that En-Gedi, where the battle that included a victory monument reporting a loss on the part of Israel and bragging against the dynasty of David, is available to be viewed in the modern day. We also have things that would verify this. As I mentioned, that victory tell would be an archaeological find. We also note that culture and customs mentioned during the time of King David are not anachronistic, which is a fancy way of saying it isn't reporting something that didn't exist at the time. Because when historians are looking at these things, and obviously if this is the case, someone is making something up at a later date after the time of David, because obviously you don't make up something before and then it comes true. That's just called prophecy. Not making up, by the way, but just noting that when they retract back things or report things back to the times that they were taking place, but include modern information that wasn't in existence at that time, as the humorous example is always given when there's photographs circulating on the internet of a Tyrannosaurus Rex holding an M16 storming the beaches of Normandy in 1944. During World War II, we note that the M16 was not invented in 1944. That would be an example of an anachronism. We also note as well that if there's, for example, customs, things that don't fit the time period, we would note when those customs were in force, note that as the date that these embellishments or even frauds were written, and say that's when David was quote-unquote invented, because they're talking about things that weren't in fact the case. We see this, and we'll get more into it when we discuss Jesus himself, in the Gnostic Gospels, which were reported frauds, when they report things that were true at the time they were written 200 to 300 years after the time of Jesus, but not the details that were given in the original Gospels, which got things right. So regarding the detail about customs that fit David's time period, what do we have that would put him in the realm of truth as opposed to mythology? Well, the incident where David tried to fake being insane, which was being God-touched, according to the ancient world. It meant that you were just to be left alone because someone who was deranged like that had the attention of things that you also didn't want the attention of. It was treated not just like a disease, but a curse, and the kind of curse that you would not want to be the sharer of. And the point being made is this: when David was visiting the city of Gath, and of course the king was more than happy to execute him since he was responsible, well known in fact, for killing his champion Goliath, David pretended to be insane and the king didn't want to touch him. Does that fit the customs of the ancient world? Well, in fact, it does. We note that in other ancient literature that these were things that the world at the time would treat people with insane tendencies, with arm's length, I should say. And that, of course, is seen, for example, in the Odyssey with Ulysses. We see that in other writings, like the astronomer Meton, Junius Brutus, and the accounts of his fictional life, and of course the Arabian king Baca, the accounts of the sultans, and other reports of the writings of Hamza. But the point being made is this: when we look at ancient history, when we look at the customs that were taking place at that time, and David does something that is reacted to in a certain way, we see from other writings in the ancient world that that was the way they saw those things. It fits the time period. And we can also note the internal evidence of accounts of embarrassment and the real places, real people, real things that were mentioned. Now, This is where we want to give a fair note to objections to the evidence that was presented to you. When people say that the existence of people, places, and things around King David doesn't necessarily mean he himself was a real person, and then they'll make comparisons to comic books that would mention actual historical figures. Just because Captain America is shown punching a real historical figure, Adolf Hitler, is not more reason to believe that he is true. But the answer that you have to be prepared to give is that this is not an appropriate comparison. Lots of mentions of real people, places, and things are exactly what it means when it comes to putting something more in the realm of reality rather than outside of it. Historical criticism is finding as many reasons as possible to move someone from that category into the other. And the more real things you have in real life, the more reason you have to put that same character in that same narrative. So understand, when people are making the objection, they're saying that, well, just because you have real United States presidents doesn't mean that this Marvel comic is suddenly in the realm of history. Well, we would grant that, but understand we also recognize that the authors of Marvel comics were careful to label them as fiction. And you see fanciful embellishments, the performance of superpowers, the existence of a lot of other fictional characters like the villains and so forth, and you see the abundance of those non-existent characters, or at least characters that, as the disclaimer goes, have no bearing in reality. That any mentions of people, real or otherwise, have no bearing on the people here, and any association is entirely coincidental. You don't see these things being mentioned in the accounts of the life of King David. And if you're going to make the argument that these things are in fact in the realm of mythology, the proof is on the person who makes the claim. We're making the claim that the accounts can be taken at face value. The person who makes the objection is the one who has to support evidence for their claims, not just to throw a monkey wrench in and say, I'm of no obligation to support my beliefs. You're the one who has to now debunk me because I came up with a better idea in my own mind. This is the idea. When you are talking about evidence, as we said, it's not, oh, I presented this mention of the victory stele in Tel Dan regarding Syria's victory over the house of David. That suddenly proves beyond any reasonable doubt that David was a historical figure. That's not our argument. And if you do argue that way, I encourage you to be careful on how you argue history. But if on the other hand you're to say, okay, here's an example, and here's an example, and here's another example, and here's another example, going through the last 40 minutes with all of you and being able to say this, and that are all real people that we can see and verify and know even to this day, then where does the scale tip? In my favor or yours? Just because there's something you don't like in the conclusion doesn't mean that the scale is going to tip any direction. The second objection is arguing that David's accounts aren't embarrassing. They're clearly embellished. And the best example that I've ever heard was in 2 Samuel 23 and verse 8, where it notes that one of his companions, is reported to have killed over 800 people in one day. The answer that you would have towards this, if they even provide an example, is that embellishment is a claim. And claims require more proof than someone's unwillingness to acknowledge something happened. Skepticism is not an argument, it's an attitude towards an argument. Where embellishment is actually discovered isn't by the presence of incredible things. There are things people have accomplished in history that the average person just is not capable of doing. But a total absence of mistakes is when people start to get curious. All historical records, as we mentioned before, of kings follow the pattern of political spin and are only going to admit what a king got right. What makes David so exceptional as a historical figure is that in of itself wouldn't be grounds to dismiss the existence of the kings who embellish details. Even if we grant your position, it doesn't prove anything. But David's accounts include more embarrassing information from his own accounts and sources, meaning the Psalms and the writings of the kings, than any other king in ancient history. And just because, again, one of those pieces of evidence listed is so rare that it would force historians, referring to acts of honesty or embarrassment, acknowledging that admitting something in his own culture that they would have seen as shameful, again, not by modern standards, and we'll talk about that in a second, means that it actually happened. And taking again into the exceptional things into consideration his men accomplished, it shows they were talented, not that they were fictional. And of course, making objections to this would be unreasonable because it's inconsistent with how we actually handle history. Now, I'll just take an aside to clarify this with all of you as well. When we're talking about accounts of embarrassment, we don't use modern sensibilities in order to determine that. If there's something that our culture finds repugnant, that's not a historical count of embarrassment. The fact that, say, for example, the accounts regarding the Battle of the Hot Gates at Thermopylae, that, of course, the reports of Spartans being especially brutal towards the slaves that they would invade and train on and so forth. The reports of Herodotus regarding all of these things and others, Plutarch and all that, they aren't what we would consider embarrassing details because the law of the land in the ancient world, specifically the time of Thermopylae, would have been where that was just assumed, that it was tribalism on steroids, that the people who, of course, you valued, respected, and regarded the dignity of were those who shared your cultural, ethnic, and religious backgrounds with. And when we note the persecution of Christians, that's not embarrassing for Roman culture because that's how the Pax Romana was enforced. You played by Rome's rules or they nailed you to a tree to suffocate. And the point is just that. When we note that, and why I was careful to mention that according to Jewish law, Jewish history, Jewish customs, the very sources and material that go before the time of David, and according to those sources, David would have had his own copy of, and that David himself quotes, praises, and celebrates in the writings of the Psalms, we see that he, according to his culture, his customs, his time, would have seen those things, polygamy, adultery, murder, deception, all as violations of law, and yet they're admitted, which is unheard of in the ancient world. And that's the point that's being made. If you have admitting to things negative, that gives me less reason to believe that the good things were embellished because they're acknowledging when they got things wrong too. And that's usually something that's only done by critics well after the fact. But in fact, when we come to David's greatest critics, it turns out it was David. And this is the point. If you say that they're embellished because there's something that you can't do in it, that just means that you don't know how history works. But if, on the other hand, you're going to present counter evidence, you don't just diminish their position. But speaking to my fellow Christians, if you're going to argue accounts of embarrassment and note, at David's time, these were their cultural standards, and he's the one acknowledging he admitted them. Show me another figure in ancient history in the role of a king who admitted to that, not who had something else pointed out to them, who they themselves admitted in 2 Samuel that I have sinned. Then we could get somewhere. But right now, the favor is still in our position. That's not a good objection. And the third and final one that we'll dedicate to time to before going out to your questions is the argument that real evidence for David doesn't appear until over a century after his death and only mentions his family name. Why can't we claim that the name of David was made up for propaganda purposes, or maybe was referring to a different house of David than the one mentioned in the biblical account? Now, the argument here is that real evidence, or evidence that counts, isn't the same thing as evidence you like or don't like. Preference doesn't mean validity. The biblical account is evidence. And, of course, we don't say that that settles it if we're speaking to a secular source. If we're speaking to our fellow Christians, then we should. But the real issue of evidence and what that actually means, the accounts of the kings and the Psalms are separate sources that verify one another. And if they don't know what the Bible is, they think it's one book as opposed to 66 books that are compiled, then they're not really in a position where they can deny history based off of a bias that shows they don't actually know how history is done, or, for that matter, know even what the material they're criticizing even is. Likewise, the fact that claims require evidence is a rule everyone has to play by. Until you can provide evidence of another David in Israel who was a king worth bragging about against the Syrians within a century of his lifetime, which, by the way, that kind of early information, you think 100 years is an astronomically long period of time. Something over 3,000 years ago, let alone something 1,000 years ago, the amount of early information that we have is so small that those kind of windows are incredibly tiny, incredibly close compared to what else we have. The best comparison that we always make is regarding Alexander the Great and regarding the archaeological finds that we associate with him. When we ask for details about his life, we go to Plutarch's Life of Alexander. Now, if Alexander the Great was running land office business through modern-day Turkey, northern Africa, and of course almost into India, then we'd say, okay, so what are the dates for your sources? If the rule is that 100 years is way too late, that these are obviously embellished and you have some mythical David figure, what do we know about Alexander the Great? Are you going to be consistent with this? Because when he was working in the 2nd century BC, Plutarch's Life of Alexander, our earliest actual complete or composite source, not just an inscription in a rock or something like that, dates to multiple centuries after his lifetime. And that's just when Plutarch is reported to have written, almost half a century after that lifetime. And our earliest copy isn't for another 500 years beyond that. So if any of us has the issue is with the person who's either inconsistent, ignorant, or outright deceptive in how they're handling history. Because the fact that this stele that mentions the House of David by name isn't being treated or considered as valid evidence shows the person either doesn't know what they're talking about, or they do and they're trying to lie. They're trying to hide the fact that that is solid history, especially when it comes to something 3,000 years before we can examine it today. If again, and this is noting the point about the suggestion of another David, when we're talking about theories, ideas, suggestions, claims, the person who makes the claim has to provide the evidence. It is an abhorrent trait of the internet age, whether it's atheists, Muslims, Christians, or any other pagan group. When they say, I'm talking to a Christian, therefore every claim I make about Christianity is the Christian's job to defend or to debunk, they don't know how conversations work. Because the moment the person makes a claim about Christianity, it doesn't matter if they're an atheist. It matters whether or not what they're saying is something they can provide evidence for, reasons to trust it. And if I make the suggestion of another David, where is your evidence of that David as opposed to the biblical David? Because I have reasons to trust the Bible. You are only trying to give me less reasons to trust it, but no reason to trust you. And this is the point. When we note that the King David mentioned in 1st and 2nd Samuel and referenced by the prophets and cited as the genealogical ancestor of Jesus, as well as the one that Jesus of Nazareth himself also credits as creating, being the root and offspring of David in Revelation 22, we have reasons to believe he was a historical figure. We have the right people at the right places at the right time doing the right things, and other things and people and places and discoveries that show more and more of this account is in reality, and we're still looking for any information that would counteract that, apart from biases and claims. On the other hand, this fictional alternative David source is not supported by anything. You don't even have the right name. So alternative explanations that don't even have that, don't have evidence to suggest the contrary, are the things that we need to be prepared to point out as a problem. And the reason, again, that names like David carry more weight in the biblical narrative and account is because of the evidence that he himself provided and that of his contemporaries, Samuel, Nathan the prophet, and Gad the scribe, the authors of the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel, according to Jewish tradition, which we can talk about the evidence of as well, if you would like to ask about that. But the point being made is this, and we'll just note that as conclusion, regarding the life of King David. When it comes to ancient history, modern history, or anything in between, if the only kind of evidence you accept is the kind of evidence that would only be possible to produce in the realms and areas of the world where video evidence and forensic science and the photocopier and everything else, that's the only kind of evidence that is reliable. Well, that would mean that unless we can also provide evidence, say for historical claims like you having breakfast this morning, I can then play the skeptic and say it's not good enough, you could have doctored it, you could have deep-faked it. Anyone can play the skeptic. It accomplishes nothing. What we actually need and what we actually have are more reasons to believe that David existed as the Bible presents him, in the right place, in the right time, and with the right people, because we know what evidence actually is. Because we're aware of our biases, but we don't allow them to fudge or ignore the actual data. The data on hand is what? We have mentions of him by his enemies by name. We have the accounts themselves, the first and primary sources about his life, including details that are not only accurate for the customs and times, but also include embarrassing details, which is gold for historians. And most importantly, we have, as a Christian authority, none other than Jesus himself, who acknowledged him as a historical person. So whether you're in the camp of liberal Christianity and taking the interpretation that David didn't have to be real in order to be meaningful, the Bible itself disagrees with you. If you take the route of the skeptic and the atheist who say that the evidence doesn't count because it mentions things that I don't like, you're the one with the bias and you're the one who's being not evidentially based. But if on the other hand we as Christians are willing to acknowledge these things at face value, it may be easy to just acknowledge the fact that I'm going to believe the Bible and end up on the right side of history by accident. But you're putting yourself in a more equipped and a better position as a witness of the gospel to a world that doesn't know it when you can give these answers effectively. These, of course, evidences will be recorded and you can re-listen to this at any time. If you email us, we'll be happy to provide transcripts and all of the evidence and links to where the research was done for this. And by the way, this isn't exhaustive. There are entire books that have been written about this subject. We are just condensing it and making it available to you. But whether it comes to me or the guy sitting in the room with a burrito, we have reason to believe the Bible's account is true, and whether it's individual names or entire scopes of history, this is how it's done. And whether or not you can answer in detail regarding the specifics of King David, understand the most important thing you can take away from this time. You know how history works, how it's examined, the kind of formatting and formulas we're plugging the numbers into. And if you can grasp that, then you're going to be more equipped when applying it to other names, like the one we're going to examine next week, like Jesus of Nazareth, for example. So thank you all for your time. I look forward to seeing how this will respond or be responded to by those who are listening. We've got time, about 5 minutes before the end of the broadcast unfolds. This isn't a question, but it's sent along to us by our live chat on YouTube from Gary. Gary is saying that Jesus will return after 6 days, 6,000 years, and then the seventh day is the Sabbath millennium. Gary, I understand exactly where you're coming from on that, but when it comes to just presenting the information, I think we need to be careful. What we're talking about here, for those of you who aren't familiar, what Gary is using is an approach that is basically using 2 Peter chapter 3 as a format for how he's viewing the ages and what God is ultimately going to do, also in light of Sabbath theology. The theme that he's using as far as interpreting the end times is that the days of man are going to follow the pattern that we saw demonstrated when God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days, and then on the seventh day he rested. That was to be Israel's model for what became the proto-weekend that we enjoy here today. Saturday, sundown Friday, sundown Saturday, then of course Sunday worship for Christians later on in the book of Acts. But the argument is, of course, that when 2 Peter chapter 3 notes that God is not slack concerning his promise, this is verses 7 through 9, but is long-suffering towards, I jumped 2 verses ahead. I'm just in verse 9. When it says to those who argue that God is slack concerning his promises, to him a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is 1 day. Now, they would take this statement made by Peter, which conversationally was applied to his faithfulness, and then move it over into Genesis and Exodus and say that there's a foreshadowing here. Once again, I'm all in favor of using Bible verses to verify biblical teachings, but we want to make sure that we're keeping the formats right and using everything in context. The argument that Jesus will return after 6 days, and that, of course, the Revelation 20 reported, which we believe here, Gary, is going to be the 1,000-year reign of Christ. They would note that as the seventh day, where we will finally rest from this fallen sinful curse, as reported throughout the Old Testament, book of Isaiah in most detail, but others as well. All these things are reporting about this last 1,000-year period, and that we're in this 6,000-year period of history. And then those who are taking these details would say that, well, then mankind has to have only been around 6,000 years if this theory is valid. And we're going to try and be honest and consistent here. This is still a theory. That, of course, we could have an idea of where we are in history and where ultimately the Lord is going to show up. This is where I think and why I myself don't subscribe to this theory. This is why we need to be careful, because if taken to its logical end, that if we can note the days of Adam, and noting that he was, of course, made on the sixth literal day of creation, that's the first important assumption we need to make in taking the Bible as our authority, using his age and the ages of those mentioned throughout Genesis chapter 5 to the time of Noah, which then we can determine based off his years, to the time of Abram, and then to the time of Abram, who was later named Abraham, to the time of David, and then we get to verifiable history where we could note our dates in the Gregorian calendar. Many have used this to directly contradict the words of Jesus when he said that no man knows the day or the hour of the Lord's return. That, of course, people, well-intended though they may have claimed, I would just call them false prophets, would say that this is why Jesus has to come back at this year, because we're approaching the 6,000-year capstone based off of all these calculations. And this is where I would say caution with this sort of approach towards Scripture. If its conclusions contradict Scripture, that may be on the part of the interpreter. I'll grant that. But it also may be just a bad formula. And this is the point. What reason do we have to associate Peter's observation in 2 Peter chapter 3 with God's timetable when the point Peter was making was interchanged? You don't see that, say, for example, a week would be considered 7,000 years to the Lord. It's always applied only in the half of the sentence. And this is my point. When Jesus' plain statements in the doctrine of imminency are laid forward, that we don't know the day or the hour of the Lord's coming, that's where I can leave it. When people come up with theories and I would happen to be wrong, I think it's good that it's ambiguous, the time period between Noah and Abram, but the issue, I think, still stands. We want to make Jesus our final authority if we speak as Christians, and our handling of the word is least dodgy and sticky as possible. Thank you all for your time. I'll look forward to talking to you all again tomorrow with Pastor Scott and company. God bless you.
You've been listening to A Reason for Hope. Thank you again for joining us as we continue our journey through God's Word, one question of the heart at a time. Until we meet again, we would love to connect with you. You can text or email your questions to questionsforhope@gmail.com. You can also find out more about our ministry at calvarychristianfellowship.com. And be sure to join us next time on A Reason for Hope. A Reason for Hope is an outreach ministry of Calvary Christian Fellowship in Tucson, Arizona.